Greetings, everyone. Pseudo-classicisms are, quote, expressions that purport to be classical, but on close inspection are revealed to be essentially different from their classical counterparts, close quote. They occur in late biblical Hebrew, LBH, Ben Sira, and in Qumran Hebrew, QH, as imitations of the diction of classical biblical Hebrew, CBH. They are classicisms in that they formally appear as in CBH, but they are pseudo in that they, quote, demonstrate a wrong analysis or interpretation on the part of the post-classical author, close quote. The existence of pseudo-classicisms implies that the language system of CBH was already considerably removed from authors of the late Persian period, close quote. In the diachrony debate, this implication has been deployed against the view that LBH and CBH both stem chronologically from the same period. Insofar as certain words and constructions have been identified as pseudo-classicisms, this argument is successful. LBH and Ben Sira and QH are later than CBH. The authors of How Old is the Hebrew Bible draw a picture of the development of Hebrew with the clean chronological break between CBH and LBH. In between these language states, Hebrew continues to be spoken, but they do not attribute pseudo-classicism to the spoken variety. Rather, the pseudo-classicisms are the mistakes of authors attempting to imitate classical texts they sometimes did not understand fully. However, if Hebrew continued to be spoken in between CBH and LBH, it seems likely that the later stage would preserve some traces of the language spoken in the post-CBH interval. I would like to argue that one, some of the identified pseudo-classicisms from LBH, QH, and the dialect of the Septuagint translators are in fact the result of natural semantic reanalysis. And therefore, two, although there is development and change from CBH to LBH, there was no severe discontinuity. Furthermore, three, others of the identified pseudo-classicisms are indeed based on identifiable CBH texts, but these are all to be found in QH, not in LBH. That is, we find a picture of continuity between CBH and LBH, but discontinuity between BH and QH. To demonstrate my first point, we must differentiate between two different motivations for pseudo-classicisms. These motivations are key in understanding the difference between pseudo-classicisms and pseudo-pseudo-classicisms. The first kind is the result of learned misinterpretation and can be traced back to the mistaken exegesis of particular texts, while the second kind, although varying in the original meaning of a word or phrase, is not exegetically motivated. I will now survey a number of cases identified as pseudo-classicisms. In my first example, I discuss one I consider to be the natural outcome of internal semantic change. The lexeme shachat clearly means pit in biblical Hebrew, including texts sometimes included in LBH, such as Jonah 2:7. Vata'al mishachat chayai. You brought up my life from the pit. Often a shachat is something you dig or go down into or come up from, establishing beyond contradiction its basic meaning. However, in the Septuagint, shachat is often translated by diaphthora, corruption, or its cognates, betraying perhaps a confusion with the homonymous verbal root shin chat tav, to corrupt, destroy, ruin. This indeed indicates an imperfect control of the original idiom. However, the Septuagint evidence is only for how its Greek translators understood the biblical text, and not for how they used Hebrew in writing or speaking, if they did. In the present case, we can speak of pseudo-classicisms only if their misunderstanding of biblical shachat led to their active use of the word in this mistaken, quote unquote, sense. Of that, we have no knowledge, nor is it at all likely, perhaps, that the translators had an active control of Hebrew at all. This caution must accompany all appeals to the Septuagint in this connection. But let us grant for now that the Septuagint rendering reflects a living usage of the Hebrew of its time. If indeed shachat had come to mean corruption, it is not so obvious that this is a pseudo-classicism. Consider, of the 23 usages of the word in the Bible, 14 have to do not with any prosaic pit, but a particular kind of pit, namely the grave. By semantic narrowing, pit in its most conventional usage can come to simply mean grave, and by metonymy, the contents of a grave, that is, the dead in various stages of decay. There may even be an example of the meaning corruption in the Bible itself. I refer to Job 9:31. As bashachat titbaleni, which the JPS translates as you would dip me in muck, and the NRSV as you will plunge me into filth. If we add to this straightforward path of semantic change a folk etymological connection with the root shin chet tav, then the change in meaning from pit to corruption is completely natural. There is yet another facet to the issue of shachat, namely its use in Qumran Hebrew. There we find no evidence of shachat in the sense corruption or decay, but ample evidence of its use to refer to another pit, namely the pit of Sheol or hell or the state of damnation. This is an extension of the biblical usage, no doubt, but is completely consonant with the way it is used there, and also is explicable in terms of a popular derivation from the root shen chet tav. There is no indication that any of the particular Qumran usages are based on commentary or exegesis of a particular biblical passage. Although there are clusters of biblical verses that mention deliverance of the righteous from the shachat, or that contemplate with satisfaction the consignment of the wicked to the shachat, these nuances could not but be expanded and exploited by the Qumran Covenanters. I've considered this example in some depth to show that at least one pseudo-classicism may have a natural path of semantic change, to set it in contrast with the proposed recipe for a pseudo-classicism. The recipe is as follows. Number one, a linguistic feature occurring in the transmitted text falls from active use. Consequently, its meaning or grammatical structure is forgotten. The passage becomes hard to understand and gives rise to commentary. One particular interpretation of the feature comes to be accepted as correct. On the basis of this new understanding, the feature is revived in late biblical Hebrew. There are undoubtedly cases in which this hypothetical procedure was followed, yielding a pseudo-classicism. I will mention a few later. However, as we have seen with shachat, a second procedure is possible. A linguistic feature occurring in biblical Hebrew undergoes natural semantic change. Consequently, in later states of the language, the original context may be understood in light of the new meaning. The original passages are not viewed as problematic. The feature in question may continue to undergo natural semantic change. The feature found in LBH or QH is not, therefore, a product of revival or imitation. The original recipe for creating a pseudo-classicism has diachronic implications in that the presence of a pseudo-classicism indicates a later state of the language. And the second recipe that I have just given has the same implication. The identification of LBH as over against CBH I consider to be secure. However, the original doctrine of pseudo-classicism, under the pressure of polemic opposition to the revisionist view, tends to overstate the discontinuity between CBH and LBH, and to minimize the discontinuity between LBH and QH. It is this view of the history of Hebrew that I want to oppose. How old is the Hebrew Bible? And other scholars see a big gap in Hebrew history between CBH and LBH, with two major events creating the discontinuity: the exile and the beginning of scripturalization of the Pentateuch and other books. However, I see the crucial watershed in the linguistic history occurring in the Hellenistic period. This gives greater weight to the elements of continuity between CBH and LBH, and to the elements of discontinuity between LBH and QH. One of the facts put forward in How Old is the Hebrew Bible is that pseudo-classicisms are more frequent in Qumran Hebrew than in LBH. I would venture to say, in fact, that pseudo-classicisms, defined as the outcome of the first procedure outlined above, are in fact only to be found in QH and not in LBH. I cannot discuss all the cases, but I will discuss one of the central ones, the varying uses of the expression milei yad in biblical Hebrew, which is the only serious instance of pseudo-classicism said to occur in LBH. The idiom milei yad, literally fill hand, occurs more than a dozen times in CBH. The idiomatic meaning is usually to consecrate someone to a sacred office. To fill someone's hand means to ordain or install that someone as a priest. The origin of the phrase is obscure, but of its primary usage, there is no doubt. How Old is the Hebrew Bible's authors point out, however, that in LBH, specifically in Chronicles, the collocation is to be understood not idiomatically, but literally, to fill the hand with a sacrifice, that is, to bring a sacrifice. Here we are told, quote, an interpretation established in the exegetical tradition, quote unquote, led to this usage. However, this view of the phenomenon has some problems. For one thing, the exegetical tradition to which the authors appeal does not appear to have existed until after the biblical period, and then only in a limited way. The only supporting evidence they provide for it is in the rabbinic Targumim, which are at least 500 years later than the chronicler. For another, the idiomatic meaning seems to have been perfectly well understood in antiquity. As the authors point out, it is used correctly, quote unquote, in the Temple Scroll and in Ben Sira. They might also have mentioned the Aramaic text 4Q 562, La yamalon yedehon lekahana. They shall not ordain them to serve as priests. Indeed, sufficient attention to the context would soon, I think, supply a reader with the correct meaning of the idiom. Whence then the so-called incorrect usage of the chronicler? Since there was no attested exegetical tradition, it seems likely that the chronicler knew the expression as a term currently used in Hebrew in religious or sacrificial contexts and improvised a new meaning based on the separate meanings of the words. That this is a natural process in language should be obvious. The parallel evolution in English of the expression begging the question is instructive. The term originated as an inexact translation of the technical term petitio principii, referring to the logical fallacy of circular reasoning, that is, concealing in the premises of an argument the proposition that is intended to be proven. As such, it is an expression unlikely to migrate far from its native habitat in the writings of philosophers and professors, or so one would think. In fact, the expression has been adopted in popular speech today, at least in the US, and repurposed to mean raising the question. That is, a technical expression or idiom that is opaque has embarked on its own popular career without any break in language transmission and without any archaizing motive. The phrase was in the air and underwent a reanalysis. The same may have been true in the case of the chronicler. The reanalysis of milei yad may have diachronic implications, but it does not support the idea that CBH was in effect a foreign language to the chronicler. I shall conclude this sampling of pseudo-classicisms with a morphological case, namely that of the lengthened imperative, that is, the masculine singular imperative with paragogic he. The function of the lengthened imperative has been illuminated in recent years by the research of Stephen Fasberg, who determined, in the words of How Old is the Hebrew Bible, that, quote, the lengthened form adds a notion of movement toward the speaker, or sometimes more generally, interest of the speaker, close quote. This obtains only in CBH texts, while in LBH texts, this nuance is absent, according to the authors. This, they say, quote, reflects more general interpretive knowledge disseminated in Jewish circles during the post-exilic period. That is, the use of the long imperative in LBH is the product of inept textual interpretation. I think, once again, the appearance of the free variant long imperative in late texts instead of the speaker benefit long imperative should be seen as a natural process. The long imperative was never obligatory, as far as we know, and the unmarked masculine singular imperative was more common. Hence, for generations of learners, the fact that there was no unmistakable form-function pairing led to the perception of the paragogic he on the imperative as a meaningless option. The diachronic implications of this process are the same as those proposed in How Old is the Hebrew Bible, but the view of how LBH relates to CBH is different. LBH is the outcome of natural processes of language change working on CBH, and not the artificial product of later exegetes laboring to master a language they never knew as natives based on texts they only partially understood. This affects our understanding of how Hebrew developed. Based on the issue of pseudo-classicisms and the like, for instance, Bill Schneidewand concludes that CBH was, quote, a dead language after the exile, quote unquote. Again, it seems to me that overstatements of this kind are called forth by the demands of polemics, a strong need to refute the revisionist view that all variation in biblical Hebrew is always and only stylistic or due to differences in register and not due to diachronic change. In this respect, I agree with the anti-revisionists that there is such a thing as LBH, a diachronically later stage of biblical Hebrew, and that CBH was not completely available as a literary dialect. However, I disagree that LBH arose out of the desire of later exegetes to imitate CBH. As noted above, I do believe that there are indeed pseudo-classicisms as the authors define them, but that they are confined to Qumran Hebrew. This sets apart QH stylistically in a global way from LBH. Among those mentioned in How Old is the Hebrew Bible are the following: teshukah, in the sense return instead of desire; the verb neot, consent, in the sense to share in a joint venture; perhaps the verb mem gimel nun, in the sense break; fa, wickedness or nothingness instead of viper, etc. More or less convincing cases have been made that these are exegetically based neologisms. Less convincing to my mind are the already mentioned shachat, the word hon in the meaning money instead of wealth, easily explicable as semantic broadening rather than misinterpretation; and ma'oz in the meaning strength rather than refuge, explicable as metonymic extension aided by popular etymology. The authors admit that pseudo-classicisms are more numerous in Qumran Hebrew than in late biblical Hebrew, but I don't think this fact has been taken seriously enough. The authors say, quote, knowledgeable Hebraists regard QH and LBH as a single phase in the history of ancient Hebrew, unquote. And therefore pseudo-classicisms, so apparently numerous in QH, must also be found in LBH. However, even if we grant to LBH all the pseudo-classicisms claimed for it, they are still much rarer there than in QH. Possibly this points to a difference between LBH and QH. There's a difference in kind and not a difference in degree. Another clue to consider, although the issue is not linked to pseudo-classicisms, is the number of new Aramaic lexical loans in Qumran Hebrew. By new loan, I mean an actual transferred Aramaic word and not a calque or other implicit type of semantic influence. Although it has been stated that Qumran Hebrew has many new Aramaic loan words, it is doubtful whether this is true. So far, I've identified 7 probable cases, which I list. This is a relatively meager harvest in comparison with the comparatively large number of Aramaic loans in LBH, an influx considered characteristic of that stage of Hebrew. If we combine this small number of Aramaic loans relative to LBH and the greater number of true pseudo-classicisms relative to LBH, the picture we get of QH is, I think, of a dialect gradually closing its doors and opening itself to influence from one direction only, i.e. from the biblical Makorot. Unconsciously, of course, the Qumran writers were open to all the influences in their environment, Aramaic, vernacular Hebrew, and no doubt others as well, as the evidence shows. In my opinion, LBH was not closed to influence in the same way as QH was, and this suggests that it was alive in a way that QH was not. My speculations run along the following lines, if you will forgive me for letting them run riot as I close. Although the exile was a catastrophic event, we should question whether it was equally catastrophic for the history of Hebrew. Although LBH is distinct from CBH in clear and obvious ways, the contrast is not so pronounced as to suggest a radical break. In fact, it is the continuity of the varieties that has given an opening to the revisionists to argue for a simple variationist scheme. One of the main new factors for LBH is the addition of an Aramaic adstratum to the Hebrew situation, which makes itself felt primarily in an influx of loanwords and calques, but which did not lead to a ground-up redesign of the language. Where we do begin to see such a redesign is in Kohelet. Here we are in the presence of something new. And although the language of Kohelet is usually treated as LBH, in fact, it should be assigned to what I call Middle Hebrew, in which I would also include 4Q MMT, the Copper Scroll, the Hebrew letters and legal texts from the Bar-Kokhba period, and ultimately Mishnaic Hebrew and its descendants. As Nili Samet has recently shown, the origin of Kohelet lies in the Hellenistic period. And it is in this period, including the era of Hasmonean domination, that we are to look for the real radical break in the history of Hebrew. The rise of Middle Hebrew, I have argued, may be connected to the geographical spread of the Hasmonean dynasty. In any case, from the Hellenistic period onward, we have firm evidence of 2 types of Hebrew: Old Hebrew, in the majority of the Qumran documents, and Middle Hebrew in Kohelet and the other texts I've just mentioned. It is possible that these 2 varieties coexisted as a diglossia with strictly demarcated social functions, or belonged to different social strata, with Old Hebrew as the language of the Judean religious aristocracy, and Middle Hebrew the language of nascent Pharisaic-style Judaism. In any case, my main point is that LBH should not be regarded as the product of Judeans who regarded classical Hebrew as a quasi-foreign tongue to be imperfectly imitated, but rather it is the natural daughter dialect of the pre-exilic language. No doubt the other participants in this workshop will shed further light on the nature of late biblical Hebrew. Thank you.